Now, Ed, can you tell me how you and Lorraine got involved in the Amityville Horror?
Well, it was Marvin Scott from Channel 5 news team. He was the anchorman at the time, and he had been involved with a haunting that we had investigated in Bloomfield, New Jersey, and he was impressed by this. So he gave us a ring and he said, we'd like you to come down and see what's going on in Amityville, Long Island. Now, this was not the Amityville Horror case at that time, you understand. Mm-hmm. This was just another haunted house, and we didn't even realize that 6 people had been murdered in that house, the DeFeo family. So we said, sure, we'd come down there, and we did. And that was the beginning of an adventure which we'll never forget, a supernatural adventure. Mm-hmm. When we went into the house that day, we didn't realize that it was diabolically infested. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have to say that Amityville was a 10.
Not every house that's haunted was built on cursed land or ancient burial grounds. Some don't need a reason. Some just wake up angry. Maybe it's the blood spilled inside. Maybe it's grief that's curdled into something hungrier. Or maybe, just maybe, the house itself was always hollow, and something found its way in. Tonight's story isn't about bumps in the night. It's about a home that swallowed its owners slowly, starting with their minds and working its way down to their souls. I'm the Creep, and this is Creep Canvas. Turn out the lights, unless you live alone. Then maybe leave one on. This is the Amityville Horror. In the stillness of December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz stood on the front lawn of their new home, a stately Dutch colonial tucked away on Ocean Avenue. The grass was brittle with frost. The river behind the property was half frozen, its surface shimmering like black glass under the winter sun. From the outside, the house looked like a dream. White siding, sloped roof, those 2 attic windows peering out like narrowed eyes. To most, it was a house with history. To the Lutzes, it was a house with potential. They had 3 children between them, Kathy's from a previous marriage, and dreams of starting over. Fresh paint, warm meals, a little space to breathe. They knew what had happened there. Everyone in Amityville did. Just a year earlier, Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family in their sleep. 2 parents and 4 children, all executed, room by room, with a rifle. There were no signs of a struggle. No one moved. No one screamed. Every single body was found lying face down, arms at their sides, like they'd been placed that way. The official story never quite made sense. But the Lutzes weren't superstitious. George was practical, sharp, clean-shaven, a small business owner with calluses on his hands. Kathy had a quiet faith but didn't speak of spirits. They weren't thrill seekers. They were just ready. They walked through the halls that first day, voices echoing off bare walls, boxes stacked in corners, the scent of fresh wood polish covering something older, hidden. They told themselves they were lucky. A home like this for $80,000? They couldn't afford not to take it. They slept there that night, under heavy blankets, in a house that had not yet welcomed them. The kind of sleep where dreams hang too close to the surface, and the shadows on the ceiling feel like they're leaning in. By the third day, George noticed the cold. Not just the chill of winter creeping in through old windows, but something stranger. Something fixed. Stationary. There were patches of icy air that never moved. One footstep to the left and the temperature would drop 10 degrees. It didn't matter if the fire was roaring or the radiators hissed from every room. The cold lingered in pockets, especially on the stairwell near the basement door. He tried to shake it off, chalked it up to drafts, poor insulation, maybe a vent issue. But it wasn't logical. He'd pass through the kitchen, feel the heat of the oven brush his face, and then, 2 steps later, feel a cold so deep it seemed to crawl through his skin and into his bones. He found himself staring into the fireplace for long stretches. He'd start tossing on logs, then forget how long he'd been there. Sometimes, Kathy would come downstairs and find him sitting in the dark, ash on his clothes, eyes locked on the last flickers of flame, like he was waiting for something inside the smoke to speak. Kathy began sleeping restlessly. She tossed and turned, muttered in her dreams, clawed at the sheets. One night, she woke up drenched in sweat, even though the room was freezing. She told George she'd been dreaming of blood, thick, dark blood, spreading across white sheets, and faces she didn't recognize, twisted in pain. The dog, Harry, began whining at night. Not barking, whining. This low, anxious sound, like he was trying to warn them without drawing attention. He refused to go near the boathouse. The one time George dragged him down the path, the dog dug his heels in and growled at the door until George gave up. And then there was the time. George started waking up, always at 3:15 a.m. without fail. Eyes open, wide awake. No noise, no movement. Just this overwhelming sense that he needed to get out of bed and check things. Sometimes the basement, sometimes the boathouse, sometimes nothing at all. Just walking, listening, like something was whispering to him in a language he hadn't yet learned to understand. He didn't know until much later that 3:15 was the time of the DeFeo murders. Missy, their 5-year-old daughter, was the first to start talking to someone they couldn't see. She had always been a quiet child, sensitive, prone to imagination. So when she mentioned she had a new friend, her parents smiled and played along. The friend's name was Jody. Jody, according to Missy, was a pig. But not a cartoon pig. Not the pink, round kind from bedtime books. This one was bigger, almost human-sized. It had red eyes that glowed like brake lights, and it didn't make any sound when it moved. Jody talks to me without talking, she told Kathy. She said she lives in the house too. It wasn't until a few nights later that George saw something he couldn't explain. He was outside walking the path between the house and the boathouse, the sky overcast and the wind slicing through his coat. He glanced up towards Missy's room to check if her light was still on. There, in the window, were 2 red orbs, perfectly round and impossibly bright, staring down at him. They didn't blink and they didn't move. They simply watched. He dropped the firewood and bolted up the steps, heart thundering. Missy was in bed tucked under her covers, humming quietly to herself. The light was off, the curtains drawn. The window was locked from the inside. When he asked her who she'd been talking to, she looked up at him with those glassy, innocent eyes and said, "Jody wanted to see you." There was one room in the house that felt heavier than the rest. It sat on the second floor, tucked away at the end of the hallway, with a single window that looked out toward the backyard. Small, quiet, and unassuming. Kathy had thought it would make a perfect sewing room, a place to sit with a cup of coffee and lose herself in fabric and thread. But the room didn't want company. The moment you stepped inside, the air changed. It wasn't cold, not like the patches of dead air elsewhere in the house, but dense. It felt like stepping underwater. Every breath seemed slower, every movement harder. George never liked going in there. Neither did the children. Even Missy, whose imaginary friend apparently roamed the house freely, wouldn't cross the threshold without her mother holding her hand. The one time Kathy brought in her sewing machine, she said the temperature dropped instantly. She could see her own breath, and though the window was closed and sealed, the curtains swayed gently, as if someone had just passed by and disturbed the air. She tried to pray, just a soft, "Our Father," under her breath. She never made it past the second line. A sound, low, guttural, like a growl with no breath behind it, rose from somewhere behind her. Not in her ears, not in her head, but in the walls. She spun around, heart jackhammering, but the room was empty. She didn't finish the prayer, and she never returned to that room again. Whatever this thing was, it didn't like to be challenged. Kathy reached out to the only person she could think of, Father Mancuso, a priest she trusted and had known for years. He agreed to visit the house, not with fear, but with caution. He didn't come to exorcise anything, just to bless the space, to bring peace. He arrived during the afternoon. The light outside was dimming, a flat gray sky hanging low over the trees. George met him at the door, quiet and tense. Kathy offered coffee. The children were in their rooms, subdued. The air inside the house felt unusually heavy. The priest moved from room to room, sprinkling holy water and murmuring prayers. Everything seemed uneventful, until he reached the sewing room. He stepped through the doorway, said a quiet invocation, and was immediately struck by something he would later describe as an invisible wall of pressure, like stepping into a vacuum. And then the voice came, not loud, not thunderous, but unmistakable, right at his ear, deep and inhuman. It hissed two words: "Get out." His hands began to tremble and his throat tightened. A sharp sting bloomed across his palms, and when he looked down, blisters were beginning to rise, red, angry, and bubbling like fresh burns. He left without finishing the blessing. Later he would come down with a fever. His voice faltered for days. When George tried to call him, the phone line cracked and popped, and then, between the burst of static, there was something else. A scream. Distant, ragged, like it had traveled a long, long way to reach him. He never set foot in the house again. As the days passed, George grew quieter. He stopped shaving, stopped laughing. He barely touched his food. His clothes hung looser each day and his face looked sunken, shadowed by something more than exhaustion. He began to obsess over the fireplace. It became his constant companion, the only place he seemed to feel something close to normal. He'd sit in front of it for hours, stoking flames, feeding logs into it long after the house was warm. He chopped wood until his hands blistered and bled. The sound of the axe against the chopping block became a drumbeat in their lives. The kids started avoiding him. He wasn't angry, not outwardly, but something in his presence felt brittle, unpredictable, like standing too close to a power line. One night, Kathy found him outside at 3 a.m, barefoot in the snow, shirtless, standing motionless beside the boathouse, staring at it like it had called his name. She didn't know how long he'd been there, and he didn't remember going. When she brought him back inside, wrapped him in blankets and sat him by the fire, he whispered something she couldn't quite understand at first. "It's not the house. It's what's underneath." She asked him what that meant, but he didn't answer. He just stared at the flames, as if they were answering back. The mood in the house shifted again. By the third week, the sounds had started. At first it was faint, a rhythmic tapping from inside the walls. Then it became footsteps. Not light, uncertain ones, but heavy. Steps that echoed across the upstairs hallway, even when everyone was in bed. George would leap from sleep and find the hallway empty, the floorboards still quivering. Then the marks appeared. One morning, Kathy was getting Missy dressed when she noticed something strange on the girl's arm. 3 parallel scratches, thin and red, running from shoulder to elbow. Missy said she didn't remember how she got them. She said Jody told her it would be okay, that it was just the house saying hello. Later that same week, they found gouges carved into the closet door in the sewing room. Deep ones, not from fingernails. These were sharp, too clean, as if something had claws. Something tall enough to reach just above the handle, and angry enough to leave a message. George blamed the dog, until he realized the door had been locked from the inside. Kathy started to dread sleeping. Her dreams were no longer vague or fleeting. They came in vivid fragments. Always bloody, always violent. She dreamed she was in the DeFeo home, walking barefoot through the dark hallways. Her hands were stained red. She could smell gunpowder in the air. Sometimes she would turn a corner and see the children. Not her own, but others. Silent, pale, watching her with blank eyes. She woke up screaming more than once. But there was one night, one moment, that stayed with her more than the others. She had gone to bed early, hoping sleep might come before the fear could catch up. George lay beside her, already tossing and turning. The room was still, save for the faint tick of a clock on the dresser. And then, without warning, she rose into the air. Not fully awake, not fully asleep, just lifted, slowly, like something unseen was pulling her upward by invisible strings. Her body hovered several inches above the mattress, arms slack, hair cascading around her face. George jolted awake to the sight of her suspended in midair, eyes rolled back, mouth slightly open, as if caught between breath and scream. He grabbed her and shouted her name. When she dropped, it was sudden, a thud against the bed that left bruises along her ribs. She didn't remember any of it, but the next morning she found deep scratches across her legs, long and thin, almost like handwriting in a language she couldn't read. The fourth week was when the house truly came alive. Doors that had once creaked open now slammed shut with force. Windows that had stayed locked since they moved in were found wide open in the morning, the curtains fluttering like they were trying to escape. The crucifix in the living room twisted on its nail, hung upside down, streaked with something thick and brown that smelled like copper and decay. And then came the walls. It started in the stairwell, a slow drip, like syrup sliding down sheetrock. George noticed it first, trailing a hand along the banister only to pull back and find his palm slicked with something sticky and green. They thought it might be mold, some kind of a leak, but the walls weren't wet. There was no source. The substance appeared out of nowhere, pulling in corners and oozing from the cracks like the house itself was infected. Missy began speaking less and less. She spent hours in her room, staring out the window, humming to herself. When Kathy asked her what she was doing, she said Jody had been teaching her a song, something to sing when it got too loud at night. One evening, Kathy found her drawing with crayons. 6 figures lying in a row, all in bed, all with red marks near their heads. Above them, in the window, was a pig with eyes the color of fire. She had never shown Missy the crime scene photos. No one had. The house never gave them a final warning. It simply turned. On their final night inside, the air had a strange charge to it, like the sky before a thunderstorm, but worse. Not electric, not natural, something older. The children were restless. They complained of itching, of headaches, of whispering that didn't stop even when they plugged their ears. Doors opened and slammed in sequence, one after another, as if someone was walking from room to room in angry rhythm. Then came the footsteps, but this time, they weren't above them. They came from within the walls, heavy thuds that moved like a person pacing in circles, only inches from where their heads lay on pillows. Kathy clutched the blankets and prayed. George sat up, sweat pulling on his neck despite the cold. And then, they saw it. In the hallway outside their bedroom, a shape began to form. Not a person, not a shadow, but a mass, thick and dark. Not black like clothing, but black like absence. It had no edges, no feet, and no face. It stood where the light from the bedroom should have reached, and swallowed it instead. Kathy screamed. The kids woke up crying. Missy said Jody was angry, and George didn't hesitate. He grabbed each of the children in his arms one by one, still barefoot, still in pajamas. And they ran. They didn't pack. They didn't turn off the lights. They didn't even close the front door behind them. The snow outside bit into their skin like knives, but it felt cleaner than what they'd left behind. They fled that house and never returned, not even to collect their belongings. They found a temporary place to stay, friends who welcomed them without asking too many questions. But the Lutzes weren't the same. George barely spoke. He seemed aged somehow, like the house had taken years from him that he'd never get back. Kathy kept waking up in the night, reaching out for children who were already safe in her arms. They tried to explain what they'd been through, but how do you make someone believe that a house can hate you, that walls can bleed, and shadows can breathe, and pigs can whisper lullabies through closed windows? A book was written, a movie followed. The world heard their story and split down the middle, half fascinated and half skeptical. Some called it a hoax, some still do. But there are things you can't fake. Fear that shows in the way someone breathes, eyes that have seen something they'll never unsee. Years later, the children, now grown, still speak of what happened in hushed tones. One of them said the house wasn't just haunted, it was hunting. Today, 112 Ocean Avenue still stands. The paint is different. The windows have changed. The infamous quarter moon eyes have been replaced, as if someone tried to blind the house. The address was even changed to throw off curious thrill seekers. But the bones are the same. And those who've stood on the sidewalk say it still feels wrong. Not cursed, not loud, just waiting. Like it knows someone else will come along. Someone eager, someone tired, someone desperate enough to believe a beautiful house at a cheap price is just a good fortune. But a house that drinks in blood doesn't forget, and a house that's been fed always wants more. Some homes become tombs, some tombs become legends, and some legends, well, they leave the door unlocked. This has been Creep Canvas. I'm the Creep. If your walls ever bleed, or your dreams ever whisper names that aren't yours, you know where to find me. Next time, we're heading into the eye of a different storm. A town soaked in rain, but it's not the sky doing the weeping. Until then, sleep tight and try not to wake up at 3:15.